the opening remarks, if each of you could talk a little bit about how you have thought about the topic of the conference, which is inequality and discrimination in the financial system. As you know, the participants here are interested in thinking about these issues from the context of financial system. Obviously, you have thought about this more broadly, but each of you could potentially talk for a few minutes about how you've thought about these things, and then I'll channel back whatever issues come up to each of you. So Sean?
This topic for me is really, I would describe it as a labor of love. And rather than looking at it from the perspective of inequality and discrimination, I think of it from the perspective of equality and fairness. So when you think about what we do as HR practitioners, and particularly those of us that are working in financial services, it is all about how, first of all, our first mission as HR practitioners is to ensure that we are creating opportunities and engendering an environment for employees, colleagues, associates to reach their best, to excel at their respective endeavors. Because when you think about the workforce, the more engaged the more engaged the workforce, the better opportunity a company has for achieving its business objectives. So we think a lot about this subject. And what has occurred, especially, I would say, following the events of last summer in Minneapolis, and we're all very much aware of the prevailing court case. A lot of companies have really taken up the mantle to ensure that the practices within those companies are practices that encourage fairness and diversity and not discourage it, so to speak. And there are a number of things that we do as a company at TIAA. We focus on is there fairness around how we recruit and attract talent, ensuring that there is a diverse slate of candidates. Once a person comes to the company, we think about mobility. How are people seeking and achieving career development opportunities? Do we have a fair performance management rating system? Are one class of employees disproportionately rated lower than another class of employees? So a lot of our processes are geared around this subject of equality and fairness. So I think that's, I'll sum it up with that, Amit.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, usually if MBA students that I'm teaching come late, I cold call them. So this was consistent then.
Remind me not to take your class.
Yeah, that's what my students also say. Raphael, did you want to say a few words as well from your perspective on this issue? Thank you.
Sure, Amit, and thank you, and good morning, everyone. It's really good to be here. A couple things. First, I just wanted to start by saying, in thinking about this space, one of the overarching themes that I have in my mind, I keep in my mind, is that financial systems inherently are not benign. They have a history, and that history does impact people differentially, depending on what their backgrounds are and where they are relative to where the systems development started. There are three things I wanted to just put a flag down on for this. The first is really how we think about discrimination from a theoretical perspective. And much of the mainstream treatment of discrimination assumes that the discriminating party is willing to incur less in terms of returns to satisfy the utility they get from discriminating. What that ignores, I think, is the reality that in many instances, the discriminating party actually is better off by discriminating, and that there's a lot of profit that occurs through this discriminating action. Now, what that means is that the equilibrium that is achieved, I think, is less than a global equilibrium, but there is an equilibrium nonetheless. And there's actually a lot of history on this. If you think about blockbusting or predatory lending or lease-to-own mortgages or how municipal bond markets have worked. There's a good historian at Chicago, Destin Jenkins, who's written on this, all showing that there are biases inherent in this, such that the people who are affected are much worse off, but the people who are doing the biases are actually better off. They're doing better. And so we do get an equilibrium, and it's a stable one. It's just not the global equilibrium. And so theories that approach that, I think, can be helpful in getting us to think hard about what it is we're facing, what we're dealing with. A second thing I would point to is very much where Sean was, and this idea about policies and processes and what their role is in facilitating or inhibiting discriminatory action. I actually was thinking about this in the context of the trial in Minneapolis, because in many instances, and actually a conversation I was having last week, in many instances, when we see practices of discrimination, people want to call it, it's a bad actor or a bad apple, and it's not about the system. And the question I have is, like, if there's one bad apple, that's one thing. But if you have 5,000 of them, you really have to start to ask, is it that we have just a lot of bad actors, or do we have a system that enables those bad actors to be bad actors, and that there may be some benefit from inhibition? So I guess the question I had was, is there a tipping point where you can tell whether the system is enabling or inhibiting? And what would that look like in terms of an identification scheme or that kind of practice, which I think it's something that's come to mind a lot in terms of thinking about how we talk about this. Then the third area I would just point to, and it's another thing I've been thinking about, is that particularly in finance, now I did a lot of my early work in underwriting and credit allocation and mortgages and other things. You used to be, if you did the aggregate average numbers, you would see disparities. Minorities are denied more, they get fewer loans, all that kind of stuff. And then you start applying controls. So in control like income, like wealth, education of the family. The challenge we have is that each of those controls actually has race embedded in it. And so because there is my predecessors were not allowed to buy houses for many, many years. We weren't allowed to participate in Social Security. So the ability of people in their older years to save money that can be passed on is just less. And so the controls that we have actually are endogenous to the problem that we're looking at. And the way I've been thinking about it in more colloquial terms is that today's people are penalized because of things that their ancestors were not allowed to do, and how we execute. And this is something I think we need to think very fundamentally about. History matters, and the arc of time and the patterns really affect what is actually accessible to people. And I think it's something we need to really have conversations about and see if there are alternative ways to approach it. First to quantify it, and then think about how do we get around it to new solutions. So I was supposed to be 5 minutes. I think I was a little longer than that, but Marianne, I think I'll turn it to you.
Great, thank you so much. And Raphael, to be honest, where I wanted to start is exactly kind of where you ended up. And this is not what I was planning when I first thought about joining this panel. I thought I was going to talk mainly about what has been most of my research focus recently, which has been more related to gender. But hearing Chris Palmer kind of really wonderful discussion of the last paper, and stressing, I think, this really important point. As economists, we've been focused on two models of discrimination, statistical and taste-based, and we've made an industry of trying to separate between these two models. And one publication in top journals, if we manage to say something about one versus the other, and I think we kind of got lost, somewhat into that, because these two models, at some point become very, very similar to one another. As Chris, articulated, you can think about, models of self-fulfilling prophecies, something that starts taste-based, ends up, kind of looking statistical. And I think we are spending too much time thinking about the difference between those two models. But furthermore, and that's really kind of going back to, kind of Raphael's last point, over the last, since the summer, I think, we've heard a lot about systemic racism. And certainly I, as an economist, have struggled with what exactly does that mean and how do I think about that? That's not part of my models. That's nowhere, but I think what Raphael said, to me is really truly important. And one way I've learned to think about systemic racism. And I'll give you an example, and I think it's particularly relevant when you think about, financial market. Not so long ago, I was on a call with the CEO of an organization that used to be Action Chicago, but it's a nonprofit that makes loans to small business. And kind of the CEO of this company is not a racist, and I'm sure that if you were to kind of go have his data and try to see whether or not when you run, kind of put a race dummy in his decision about making loans, the race dummy would not show up. Like, he's not a racist, but yet he made the following realization, which is that because he puts weight on collateral in the decision of whether or not to make a loan, that is going to end up being racist. And why? I mean, I think you had a very good way of saying this. Because of a history of racial segregation, because of a history of slavery, we have big wealth differences, historical wealth differences between Black and poor, between Black and white. And so by putting weight on collateral, I end up making decisions that are racist, even though, kind of if I were to run the models that I feel like as an economist I've been running forever, there would be no race dummy that would emerge from, my analysis of his lending decision. And I think that's a really, really powerful point, especially when we think about finance. If we think about where, a history of racism in this country is going to be particularly long lasting, it is when it comes to wealth accumulation. And this is where I think we need to kind of really draw much more attention and think about the implications of. So sorry, I feel like it's a repeat of what Raphael said, but that was really kind of top of mind, and kind of especially because of Chris' kind of really great discussion. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to talk about gender. I'm happy to talk about diversity and inclusion and all that stuff, but maybe I'll stop here for a moment.
All right, great set of remarks and things for us to talk about a bit more. Maybe I can start a little bit with Sean first. Sean, you mentioned how you spend time thinking about both screening and once you hire, thinking about career progression, mobility, and so on. As economists, we spend a lot of time thinking that we can collect data, do analysis, and come up with ways in which we can make the system better. So in your experience, which has been vast and you spend a lot of time in finance sector, are there things that matter when you do these things in terms of data? Was any rating that you did inside the firm useful, both for hiring as well as for mobility and career progression from those perspectives?
Yes, and I would say, Amit, more so than the strength of the data, what makes the biggest difference in my view is the strength of the character of the leadership of the enterprise. This sort of relentless pursuit of ensuring that there is fairness in the workplace. And the data in a lot of instances is very telling. I recall an instance where we were analyzing the performance ratings across the company, and what we observed in some instances, in some parts of the business, particularly on the operations side, we saw some statistical anomalies where one class of employees was seemingly rated lower than another class of employees. And when we sort of dug into it, we realized part of the problem was not so much the ratings, but part of the problem were the performance objectives that drove the rating. We had made a mistake by creating the same performance objectives for people who are new in a role versus those that have had some experience in that role. And we recognize if when you create performance objectives, those objectives, apart from being measurable, they should also be achievable. And think of a sports player. We don't judge a rookie NBA player or NFL player with the same statistics that we judge someone who has had a lot more experience and much more of a journeyman or woman in that field. And we need to apply that same principle. If you are new in a role, your performance objectives should correlate to that experience, and it should be achievable. So when you rely on the data, you do have an opportunity to sort of discover anomalies and then obviously correct them.
Thanks, Sean. Raphael, Sean has talked a lot about data and leadership and so on. And you and Marianne talked about things which are basically prescribed as rules out there. And some of these rules, if we follow, we are implicitly doing discrimination. If we don't take into account that the endowments of whoever is out there matters clearly, and that changes the way we think about an equilibrium. Now, inside the Fed, how are you thinking about this? Because, Fed has an issue like the rest of the profession in terms of the composition of its employees, as well as the rules it sets. So obviously it's a major change if we want to do something about it. Leadership, like Sean said, is important. So how are you tackling this and thinking about this?
Well, let me just echo what Sean said at the beginning of his second remark, which is that leadership does matter and intentionality is important. And you actually, if you want to make progress, you have to look, and you have to know what the data are, and you have to look deeply into that. So at our bank, we've been doing that for a long time throughout the staff. So we know exactly where there are disparities. We do it by race, we do it by gender, we do it by experience. We actually try to know what's going on in our institution at a very deep level. And then once we understand sort of the what, then we can sort of dive into the why. And these things become very, very complicated. Some of what Sean was talking about is actually true. And there's been a lot of discussion that we've had about, how are we writing our job descriptions? Are we falling back on simple heuristics that may have biases embedded in them? Are we tying much more to pedigree than skill, for example, in making assessments about whether people can do things and what they can do? And so we're looking at all those sorts of things. I would also say that we are really trying to understand where the pool is and where our potential employees are going to come from, and are finding that that's a challenge. So in economics in particular, there are just so many people that are out there that have the diverse profile, and so that's why I like doing these sorts of things to help people who are not from traditional backgrounds see that the field cares about this, is thinking about this, and trying to do right by this. I think that's an important signal that we have to send collectively. The other thing I would also say on this is that I've become increasingly sensitive to the reality that experiences drive staff expectations, and those expectations will then drive staff behavior. So if you're a staff member and you believe, for whatever reason, that African-American women are only going to be promoted to a certain level, then if you're an African-American woman, you're going to be less willing to apply for things, because you're going to see in your mind that that's just going to be a waste of your time and a waste of your effort. You're not going to get that anyway. So some of what we're also trying to do is really deal with expectations. And I would just say this expectations issue shows up in many places in finance. So if you think about people applying for refinancing, we know that African Americans apply less frequently. I think part of that is because many of them are lucky, feel that they're lucky they got the first mortgage and aren't going to even bother trying for the second one, because to what extent, what's the likelihood of lightning striking twice? And so thinking about those sorts of things and how the system and people's perceptions of the system drives behavior is something that we're really trying to unpack, both internally to our institution, but also more broadly in terms of how these markets function.
Amit, there the two things. Everything you said, Raphael, resonate, but two in particular for me was your discussion on the job descriptions. We actually went through a process of really taking a more rigorous and more clinical approach to job descriptions, because we found that we had job descriptions that had sort of these arbitrary requirements, must have 8 years of this. Well, why is it 8 as opposed to 6 as opposed to 10? And then that led us to another discovery, which is a person's experience and suite of skills should help inform that person's ability or that person's propensity to learn and to grow. So when we find ourselves caught in this trap of, well, this person doesn't have this exact experience I'm looking for, well, have they demonstrated that they are a continuous learner? Have they demonstrated that they have a work ethic? If they've demonstrated that, that means they have potential. And why are we not providing that opportunity? Because it's pretty hard to have to have a skill without getting experience, and that experience had to start at a point in time.
Thanks, Sean and Raphael. Marianne, may I ask, like you've looked at obviously not just racial and gender discrimination, but spent a lot of time thinking about governance and so on as well. And is this notion of leadership or governance something that you've seen in your research mattering? And in particular, I'm thinking, like, is there something special about finance that stands out when you think about the kind of work you've done, or is this something that is, is true everywhere? And finance, we just think that finance is special, but these kind of things happen everywhere. So if you might be able to comment a little bit on these.
I guess I know, I can provide a very incomplete answer to this question. Again, I think about, these matters more from a labor market context. So I can try to think about answering this question in terms of like what it means, kind of there's something special about working in finance versus working in other sectors of the economy. And again, even more narrowly answering this question, kind of when I think about gender and working in finance, I think there are a few things that are special. I mean, we know that these are occupations where, kind of there's a lot of inflexibility, where there is a lot of, kind of fairly long hours, where there are sometimes expectations about, kind of aggressivity and lots of risk taking. And all of these kind of correlates of working in finance have had, kind of negative implications for women's representation in those sectors. I think when it comes to like the structure of the work, the long hours, the inflexibility, we have, really, really good evidence that those are job characteristics that make it very difficult for women that are trying to combine their career with, other responsibilities that they have in the home. So the financial sector, because of the way the jobs kind of remain structured, creates particular hurdles for women. When it comes to other features of these jobs, such as kind of more aggressivity, maybe more risk taking, there I think it's a longer conversation one could have. But it is true that there are stereotypes that kind of people have about women. That and those stereotypes might be that women should not be as aggressive, should be nicer. And, if women are endogenizing those stereotypes, if these stereotypes become prescriptive, then women start kind of, presenting traits at work that then may hurt the ability to progress further in the workplace. But that's also my chance to kind of say another bit, which I really wanted to, kind of bring in this, in the context of this panel. And again, thinking about, kind of the role of research. There is a cottage industry. Again, I'm going to focus on gender here, but there's a cottage industry of papers that get very well published that, kind of tell us that there are systematic differences, between the genders. Competition, risk aversion, ability to negotiate, et cetera, And I really worry very much about, publication bias and the fact that it's easier to get, papers that find, kind of gender differences to get published, than papers that do not find such gender differences. While one looks at more meta-analysis on these questions, the key hypothesis that seem to emerge is that across a wide range of traits, you find way more similarities among the genders than differences. Or another way to put it is that there might be sometimes small differences in means between men and women on certain traits, but those differences in means are minimal given the within gender variation. And I think it's a really important point, because I think the more we repeat those narratives, in our research, it's more likely to get picked up in the media, the more difficult we make it to progress and move away from these stereotypes, which, kind of keep on enabling often inaccurate beliefs and have kind of ricochet effects for women's career.
So I totally agree with that. And I would also say some of these differences are also endogenous. I feel like society drives some of these differences in creating expectations about how people are supposed to behave and interact. And you see this in gender, but you also see this across a lot of ethnicities. So I had a discussion with some of my Asian employees, and they were telling me that, when they were growing up, this Asian culture says that the nail that's sticking out gets hammered down, right? As opposed to sort of a more Western, the squeaky wheel gets the oil type of approach. And so those sorts of issues are not actually inherent to the person. It's sort of what the person has learned through many, many years, and they are potentially penalized by that. Another thing I would ask is, are the things that we see as fundamental parts of our culture, say the aggressiveness in finance or whatever it is, are they essential for being excellent in the field? Or are they just things that we've evolved to this place? And so that's just how it is. And we've now assumed that you have to be that way to be great. Is that actually true? And to what extent should we be challenging that notion to say there are many ways to get the pathway to success and the positive outcome, and that we should be challenging our culture? I think the field of economics in general needs to be thinking about this in terms of how we do our seminars and how we interact with each other at a basic level. It has worked for some, but for others who could have been potentially outstanding, it's been off-putting, and then we lose them from the field. And that's a loss for all of us.
So thanks, Marianne and Raphael. Sean, maybe because you've spent such a long time from HR and you've thought about some of these issues, and being in finance, you're probably getting the same selection that we in finance study when we study the financial sector, in terms of who is applying for jobs and who is then moving across in the firm or their career. How do you manage, do you find that folks who work in finance are different in the way they behave? Is there more stereotype in such individuals? And what can an organization do, like TIAA, in terms of trying to de-bias or get the stereotype out in terms of how decisions are getting taken and so on? Because the reason I'm asking, I'll just preempt it, is because one of the objectives I'm hoping of this panel is that I throw out for the audience and whoever is listening, the kind of things that we can do as academics in terms of our research. So anything that you can tell us that has worked in your experience is very useful, because we only look at data. We don't know exactly inside the firm what has been working and what has not.
Yeah. Having worked at 6 companies, so I've been at super large companies, mid-sized companies, small companies. I was at Merrill Lynch. I was at a small bond. You mentioned the municipal bond market earlier, Raphael. I was at Fitchick as the CHRO there. I worked in Vermont. I was in Tokyo for 2 years and London for 3, Lagos for 1. And I say that only to say, and this is going to appear to be very unscientific, and I recognize and appreciate I'm among a very scientific cohort here. It is my experience that the biggest driver that determines behavior is the culture of the company. So it's less of a case of finance versus the airline industry, hospitality industry. It's more of what is the culture of that company? Is that culture collaborative, or is that culture contentious, or is it constructively engaging? And one of the virtues I feel of working at TIAA, and why Roger Ferguson was so perfectly compatible to who we are, and we feel the same about Tashonda Brown Duckett's arrival, is that the ensuring that it's a culture of respect and dignity where people have an opportunity to express difference of opinions without fear of reprisals, that people can challenge each other respectfully, that we can provide feedback to each other on an ongoing basis, and both good as well as developmental feedback, that those are the attributes that really drive the behavior of an organization.
Sure. I mean, one thing I would add here is that, obviously as a researcher, what we are missing is access to data and access to company data, an ability to try to evaluate what's happening and what has been successful, what's not successful. So if I think about, again, since the summer, it is very clear that lots of companies are rolling out, anti-bias training program. And my guess is that that's what most of them have been doing. I don't think we have, kind of systematic evidence that it works. Most likely it doesn't work, but we need to document, an ability to document that, and access to any kind of company data. This makes it really impossible. This is a call to whoever is on this panel has access to like corporate partners that are really serious, not just paying lip service to the issue, but really want to be agents of change, to say that we can help. It's kind of, we're good with data, so we can try to think about, kind of really ways to evaluate and assess what's working and what's not. And
Marianne, have you explored getting access to the company's engagement results data, the sort of, companies that do all of these?
No, so I've not, and I'd love to talk to you about this offline. I think the main issue that we face as researchers, and I'm guessing many of the people in this, in this panel have tried many times to, kind of engage with companies on issues related to gender and racial, kind of racial gaps, is, very often you find some very willing people inside of the company, but then the legal counsel shows up, and that's kind of basically the end of the affair. So I think though that if we want to make progress, rather than just having a year of like anti-bias training program that don't do anything happening and we feel like we've solved the problem, we need to find ways to engage with corporations. And maybe the solution is that no corporations wants to be the one, kind of being the demonstration case of like no impact or bad results, but maybe we need a coalitions of corporations that are willing to share, to share the data. It makes it easier to do it as a group than single. The other thing that I wanted to say on this point is that just, it's a straightforward thing, but like people talk about diversity and people talk a lot about diversity. I think we should talk much more about inclusion. Diversity is quite easy to do. We can find people and put them in corporations. Inclusion is much, much harder. And we have, as far as I know, certainly as an economist, kind of no good ways to think about how we make organizations more inclusive. And this is another area when I think about future research, we should team up with psychologists, social psychologists, people that know much more than we do about how we foster inclusivity. Sorry, that was a lot.
So yeah, that was a lot. And I wanted to respond to like all of it. So I'm going to just go, and I may forget some things. So, first on the data point, we are wrestling with that in Atlanta right now. So I would say this more generally. Corporations across the country are all recognize that this is much more of an issue than they were taking as the point, I think. And they're willing to do things. But then the question is, well, what are the things that you should do? And one of these questions, the issues is, how much are you going to track? How much are you going to report? And how much are you going to share? And there's a tension because the general counsels, I have a general counsel as well. So they don't want, no, general counsel's view is no is the best answer because then it just keeps you from being in trouble. Like there's no risk in no. But I actually think there is risk in the sense that if you don't really know the data and the reality, it's hard to fix something. Like you can't fix something you don't know is broken. So we have to do that. Chambers of commerce across the country are all engaging with their membership to find ways to engage. And there's a debate going on among many of them. To what extent are they going to ask the members that have taken pledges and things to report data? And to what extent is that data going to be allowed to be made public? And those are things that are very important questions. I think if it's a collective, it's more likely to succeed. So going to the US Chamber, or maybe if you see chambers in particular areas and engaging in conversation to say, would you share your information with us as a collective, de-identified, you know, all that kind of stuff. I think there is some possibility of that happening. Marianne, you also talked about anti-bias training. I actually think some of them work and some of them don't. But whether that happens, I think is tied to what Sean was talking about the leadership and the commitment of the institution to take the learnings and then institutionalize them. Some do it as a check the box, yeah, I gotta have bias training, so we're just gonna do it and I can say we did it. Others are like, well, no, this bias training is actually giving me information that I can really use on a day-to-day basis. And what would be interesting from a research perspective, and this may be where engagement could be helpful, is trying to distinguish between those two types of firms. Like, is there a way to identify them and then potentially link that to outcomes? Because you know, one of my underlying tenets and sort of approaches to everything is, if people see something successful, they'll run and do it. So if we can demonstrate that inclusion and that success and that attention to anti-bias actually makes your organization work better, people will then start running to it. So if there are ways to show that, if there's an evidence base, and that's a body of research that could be a whole lot bigger, just to understand sort of how that plays out. And then the last thing is, you talked about inclusion. We changed the name of our organization internal that focused on this to the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And those are actually three different things. And they need to be treated differently and acknowledge that, you know, diversity is nice, you need to understand that. But if you have diversity but don't have equity, because people are all coming to your organization in different places, the outcomes are not going to play out. You're not going to get the most out of your staff. And then inclusion is like, what are the more institutional, cultural, structural things that are preventing everyone from participating to their fullest extent, and that's a whole different issue. So the solutions for the various things, I think, are needed to be distinct. And so a field sort of, how should we think about inclusion? How do we define it? What does it look like from an observational perspective? What measures? I think that's a rich area where we don't have as much as we should. So I totally agree with what you're saying.
All right, there is one more theme that I wanted to touch on before I open the floor for questions, and that's related to lots of papers that were in the conference, and if you look more broadly in the NBER working paper series that comes out every week, you see this flavor that, you know, with advent of tech and lots of big data and AI, there's a perception that maybe this is something that will help us address some of the challenges we have. Certainly, data allows us to be able to maybe better disclose things. And maybe disclosure is a interesting thing to put in front of everyone, because at least it gets diversity up. You talked about challenges in inclusion and equity. That's not going to change with just data and disclosure. But do you all have any views on whether tech is going to be useful or is going to be creating its own set of problems? Because certainly, lots of people talk about biases that come in algorithms and other things too, which is another Pandora's box, I feel. But do you all have any views on this? Probably, Raphael, this affects you the most directly, because you have your supervisors going inside banks and trying to use their models and so on. But anyone, please.
Raphael, you want to start? I'm happy to start. I mean, I think I do personally see, you know, kind of some, you know, some hope that, you know, kind of technology could be used, you know, for the better, especially when it comes to, you know, addressing, you know, implicit bias in, you know, think about, again, HR decision, or, you know, we've seen some work on, you know, how judges could be equipped with, you know, kind of algorithmic models to make the decision. So I think it's definitely, I think, an area of hope. As you said yourself, Amit, I think it's tricky because, you know, kind of we need data to train, you know, to train this algorithm. And to the extent that the data that can be trained on was data that, you know, kind of was based on decisions that were made by, you know, people that had those biases, it's going to be hard to, you know, kind of end up, you know, with the algorithms that have, you know, that have taken the bias away. So but I do think this is obviously an area of great interest for the future. And I think talking to a lot of people that are on the computer science of all of these things, it's actually quite interesting to me that what they seem to be most interested on is how humans, kind of would use the algorithm, right? So there's a model where we're going to replace the human with the algorithm. There are the models where we're going to leave, discretion to the human to make decisions, but we'll also, give him or her the result of the algorithm, and how that combination of human decision, supported by, kind of by data will change outcome is interesting. But the final thing that I will say though is that, algorithm, as I said in my first intervention, again, thinking about finance, think about, kind of environment where, wealth accumulation is going to be a big factor. Algorithm are not going to solve, issues that have to do more with the history of racism. That means that there are systematic differences between the gender in terms of how much wealth, so between the race in terms of wealth and collateral. So we need something else to address, that.
So Marianne, that was well said. I'd say when I think about technology, I really think about really the varying sources of bias. So we know that there are biases just observationally. So every human, when they look at and they see someone, biases are going to happen. That we are hardwired for that. Technology can take those sorts of biases out because the assessor doesn't actually look at things. So they won't know what the race of people's pictures on mantles will be in appraisals, for example. And so that will become less of an issue. So that can be helpful. The other thing that technology can do is it can narrow the gray area to some extent. So I think about some of my earliest research was on automated underwriting and its ability to reduce bias in wider bands of sort of mortgage lending. Now, what that was not able to do was eliminate gray areas altogether. So even in that context, there were still places where discretion was going to come to play, but the technology caused those circumstances to be far fewer than what we saw in the past, and so that you can make benefits in those regard. But anytime there's discretion, you're going to have this issue, and technology in and of itself won't eliminate that more broadly. So we have to be mindful of that. And then one thing that I agree with Marianne on, if the data going in has bias embedded, then the system's going to have bias embedded. But one other thing I worry about is in these AI type systems where the systems learn through experience, like how do we track what the learning is to make sure that they're not learning biases and keying on things that would lead us to result in bias, and how would you monitor that, and how would you go about overseeing, governing, regulating that kind of system? I think that's a real challenge that we have to face, because as far as I understand these systems, there aren't constraints on what the system can learn. And so,
the learning begins with a human being.
Yeah, and so exactly. So there's some risk there that we're going to have to think about principles and practices to try to avoid the worst outcomes.
Sean, did you want to add to this?
No, I think it was very well captured by Raphael and Marianne. The point I was just making is that, to Raphael's point with the AI, is that a human being is the one that starts the AI to begin to learn. So it starts with a human.
All right. Why don't I open the floor to the folks attending? If you want to ask a question to the panelists, please raise your hand, and I'll ask you to. You can. All right. So I already see Manju. I see Tarun. So Manju, did you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Amit. This was a fascinating panel discussion. So I want to thank all the panelists. I had a couple of questions. So one was, there was talk about how big data can reduce bias because the human bias of seeing someone and the reaction isn't there. But there's also the other point that you raised earlier, that it's not just using race and gender variables explicitly. There are all these other variables with the history, and some of them we know about, and some of them maybe we don't even know about, but big data can unearth them. right? And so that seems like a huge challenge, you know, and how do you monitor it, and how do you figure that out? That was one question. The second question I had was, you know, I thought a very interesting point that you made on culture and how important culture is in an organization. And Marianne made the point of, you know, sharing the data, which of course as researchers, we think would be a fabulous thing. But I'm also interested in knowing just internally, how do you measure if your culture has actually improved or changed? Typically, you see just tipping points, right? When there's this huge complaint or this huge scandal. But suppose you do have this culture where, you know, the African-American lady doesn't apply for a job. You know, these are very subtle. And you know, you have to be very perceptive to know these things are happening. So how do you even measure these? In order to improve something, it has to be measurable, right? So that you can quantify it. And so I'd be interested in hearing some thoughts there. Thank you.
So I'll speak to the second one, and I'll speak on behalf of Sean because he mentioned it. You know, one of the things that we do a lot of is engagement surveys to really assess the extent to which our staff feels engaged with the institution and its mission. And we use that as a proxy for the success of the culture in empowering people and getting them to really bring their whole self to work and then use all of their skills in that regard. And one thing that we've seen is that there is a correlation between levels of engagement and feeling of bias and feeling that the system is not really engaged or structured to help them. And changes in engagement are also signs that something different has happened in terms of how people are experiencing their institution. And so, you know, when Sean mentioned like trying to get data on engagement surveys, I think that he's exactly right as one vehicle for capturing culture. So, but it's a hard thing. And one thing that we do is, because we know that different people come with different backgrounds and affinities toward various tools, we try at our bank to provide multiple channels for people to provide that feedback, whether it be through an engagement survey or through our HR function or through our equal employment opportunity function or through me. So I basically told every staff member, if you feel like the culture, you're experiencing the bank differently than how we've talked about in terms of integrity, excellence, and respect, you have license to send me an email and we can talk about it. And just trying to say any way possible for you to voice that so we can be aware and try to fix it is important. And then on your first point, you're exactly right. I think that big data can help us. I hadn't really thought of it like that, but can help us identify items that we may not have been aware of that we should be thinking more intensely about. So that's actually a very, very interesting observation.
Thank you, Raphael. Manju, the only thing I would add to Raphael's great comments is as follows. In terms of a real life example, we conduct engagement surveys multiple times during the year. In 2019, and when we do the survey, it's important to appreciate that it's cut in all different ways. It's cut by age, it's cut by gender, it's cut by ethnicity, it's cut by role, it's cut by city. It's cut in a myriad of variables. We discovered in 2019 that generally speaking, colleagues of color at a particular level of the organization and below raised abject concerns around mobility, career development, my opportunity to move through the organization. In 2020, even despite the challenges of the pandemic, we recommitted ourselves to mobility. We looked at the data and we discovered that disproportionately we tended to place people in roles as opposed to relying on a posting system. We established clear governance around that we will post more roles and place less roles. And as a consequence of that, we can see how we have made traction on career development and mobility. And in 2020, when we looked at our engagement results, it reflected that. So we had 2 data points. One data point is we could actually see the progress that we are making around career development. The other data point is the people that are filling out the survey are expressing a greater level of satisfaction than they did before. So I agree with everything that Raphael articulated.
Just super quickly, I agree with all that was said. I mean, a variable that on the issue of the measurement of the culture, I mean, there's one variable that very often people kind of mention to me, which is like a sense of belonging. And that's, you know, kind of one of the key variables you may want to look at. On your other questions about, you know, about the models, I really think it's going to be exciting. So once we have access to this data, and let's say that we can agree, again, think about finance and access to loans, you know, let's say that we could agree on a list of variables that we think are really reflecting a history of racism. I think it would be fantastic to go and like run some algorithms to try to predict whatever we care about, which is like likelihood of default or repayment, running some of these algorithms with and without, you know, those features that we know are most likely to be reflecting a history of racism. So that would give us a sense of like, what are we leaving on the table financially by ignoring from our decisions, especially those features where we know that, you know, black and white are going to be at very different places because of where this country comes from. So I think the frontiers of research questions are, you know, are really super, super exciting.